Once again, justice is not served in the United States. A grand jury decided to clear a New York officer in the videotaped chokehold death of Eric Garner, similar to the officer who was cleared of murder charges of Michael Brown. Protests as a result has erupted across the U.S., especially in New York and Los Angeles. In this edition of the debate, we ask, is this race-related? Another case of police brutality, discrimination, whites against blacks, blacks' distrust for police, or a combination of all?
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. These were the last words of another African American who was killed at the hands of police in New York City. But now it has become the slogan of protesters who are infuriated by the extent of U.S. police brutality and the injustice against people of color. A grand jury decision not to indict Pantaleo brought many Americans to streets at intolerable injustices against the black community. In New York City, the youth who were trying to get into the Rockefeller Center clashed with police. Dozens were arrested there. There were separate protests in other locations of the city, including in the Times Square and the Great Hall of the Grand Central Station. A similar demonstration was also held in Washington, D.C. Protesters in California's Los Angeles also took to the streets to condemn police brutality and racial profiling across the nation. The decision not to indict the killer cop echoed a similar ruling last month by a grand jury in Missouri, which declined to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of Michael Brown. The officers in both cases were white, while both men they killed were unarmed African Americans. These have fueled nationwide protests over race relations and excessive police force. Studies show that every 28 hours a black man is killed by police in the United States. But it seems words speak louder than actions to officials, as they only pay lip service to the issue of the U.S. police brutality.
Now that the local investigation has concluded, I'm here to announce that the Justice Department will proceed with a federal civil rights investigation into Mr. Garner's death.
When anybody in this country is not being treated equally under the law, that's a problem. And it's my job as president to help solve it.
However, activists and the family member of the victim say they have no confidence in local state prosecutions as they work hand in hand with local police. They say they'll press ahead with their protests until justice is served for the cleared white police officer.
I'm determined to get justice for my husband because he shouldn't have been killed in that way. He shouldn't have been killed in any way. He should be here celebrating Christmas and Thanksgiving and everything else with his children and his grandchildren.
It is time for a national march to deal with a national crisis. No, we're going to bring Ferguson, Cleveland, and all of New York to the nation's capital.
That's right.
To say enough is enough.
Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. We have the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, Omali Yeshitela, who joins us from Tampa. We have president of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane, who joins us from Washington. I'd like to welcome you both. Let me start with you, Omali Yeshitela. I watched the video again, this being about maybe the 20th time, of Eric Garner, and I watched some of the photo stills, and it was very hard to see one of those stills, and that was one of the police officers there pretty much crushing his skull against the sidewalk. I mean, this is separate from what happened in Ferguson in the sense that there's videotape footage of what occurred. What more could the U.S. justice system want? And yet they have let go of this police officer and not press any charges.
Yeah, that's a serious issue. What more could the U.S. justice system, or what more could Barack Hussein Obama want? I mean, it is clear that Eric Garner was murdered by the police. And I'm glad that you mentioned the fact that it was not simply the cop who was choking Garner that's an issue. The way they treated him with total disregard for him as a human being, the way the police put his knee in his head and was pushing his head into the cement, it's clear absolute disdain for him as an African human being. but it's traditional. And we should not act like what happened with Eric Garner or what happened with Mike Brown on August 9th is some aberration. It is typical treatment that African people in this country have historically experienced at the hands of the United States government and its agents, including police organizations throughout this country.
Michael Lane, I don't want to make this a race-related topic with my next question, but I'm going to address it from a white man's point of view, that they might say another day, another death, and a police officer is not charged.
Well, I don't think that's a fair way of putting it. Look, everybody, I think the whole world, has seen this videotape. What you see is the impression of police overreaction in a specific situation, but nothing about the tape leads you to believe that there's any racial implications about this at all. In fact, the supervising sergeant who was there supervising and directing her team for the arrest of Mr. Garner was herself an African American, and she never told them to stop, never told them they were doing it wrong, never called them off. So there's a lot you can say about whether or not the police handled the situation right, but there's not much at all to say about race. It hasn't become apparent yet.
Do you agree with that point made by Michael Lane?
Well,
Omali
you use
Yeshitela?
this term. You use this concept. You use this concept of race, but the reality is that African people in this country exist as a subject and colonized people, just as people in Afghanistan and Iraq who are occupied by foreign and hostile troops. Doesn't matter if Colin Powell is over the troops, we're still looking at white power. Doesn't matter if there was some supervisor in New York that was an African, it's still a hostile aggression that's coming from outside our community to brutalize people in the community who happen to be African. And so the reality is, in the United States today, with the largest prison population in the world, some 2.3 million people locked up. If you took the Africans and Mexicans and indigenous people out of those prisons, it would be reduced by half. So you can say that you can attempt to maintain that the situation with Garner was some isolated situation. So was the situation with Mike Brown. So was the situation with Tamir Rice, who was shot twice by cops in Ohio, in Cleveland, Ohio. And you can take all of them and say that they're simply individual incidents, but the fact of the matter is that there's a historical context within which the treatment of black people have to be looked at, and you just can't go incident by incident and try to come up with a conclusion by a simple, specific incident.
Michael Lane?
Well, I agree with a lot of that there is a history here. The history is not always pretty. Our country is not perfect. We've made great strides in the last, forever, since the beginning. We've made great strides, starting with the Civil War up through today. However, that doesn't necessarily overlay the facts on these three cases. Tamir Rice in Cleveland, it looks like that was just, sort of an emotionally disturbed officer who should never have been given a badge and a uniform in the first place. Again, nothing overtly racial about it. I've already talked about the situation with New York, where there doesn't appear at this point to be anything racial about it, although I'm willing to go through the Attorney General's civil rights investigation, and I'll keep an open mind as to what they might find out during that. When you talk about Ferguson, that's an entirely different thing. I don't know why anybody is rallying around this Michael Brown flag. It's the wrong icon at the wrong time, in the wrong place, for the wrong cause and the wrong issue. Michael Brown was a very bad guy who attacked and charged an officer even after he was shot, when the officer had his gun pulled. That's about as stupid as it gets.
Omali Yeshitela.
First of all, that's untrue, everything that's been said. And secondly, the oppressor cannot say who the icon or the poster child for the oppressed should be. You can't come and kill somebody in our community and say that now you are celebrating or upholding the wrong person. You should be upholding somebody else. The fact is that the colonizer cannot make a determination of whether or not the colonizer is good or bad. The reality is that if we looked at the treatment of Mike Brown as an example of somebody being a bad guy, what we are faced with is the fact that in this country, America, that Mr. Lane wants to try and separate from his history. In fact, white people in America possess 22 times more wealth than African people in this country. And that's even during the difficult economic times that we are confronted with. And that's really interesting, given the fact that America likes to put itself forward as a place where if hard work will be rewarded by income. And if anybody worked harder than black people in this country, that would be a meaningful explanation. But with all the work that Africans have done against our will in this country, we should be the richest people here. Don't say that somehow we got to separate each of them and examine them separately. What about the man who was walking in his apartment in Brooklyn and just walked out the door of an apartment with his girlfriend and his child, and the police just gunned him down for no reason at all? Was he mentally disturbed as well? And if he was mentally disturbed, it seemed to me that the police department in this country have a real problem, because there are a lot of mentally disturbed white men with guns and uniforms roaming through African communities throughout this country.
Wow, I counted about 4 subjects here that we can talk about, from income inequality to gun control. A lot of good points. But before we get a reaction from Michael Lane, that was very good, Omali Yeshitela. Let's listen to some of the viewer comments, and then we'll get back to some of those important points that you made there.
Repeating the past legacy, it's horrible to see the way that white policemen choked Eric, the black man. It is unbelievable, a shock. It is clear that the police officer did an illegal chokehold. However, a secret court gave the police officer immunity. It doesn't matter what color you are. Criminals are criminals, and it's the cops' job to take them down and lock them up. It's 2014, and blacks are still screaming about slavery and race. Personally, I think black people are the most racist people on this planet. Things won't change until blacks see race isn't an issue anymore. It's stupidity. That's the real problem here. Been happening since slavery. Black people have received a wake-up call. Your oppressor can never give you equality. I wonder why they think they are the most civilized country in the world. They are the most racist country in the world, and their judicial system is nonsense.
Some of the viewer comments there. It's very interesting, Michael Lane. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 viewer comments, and 3 of them are race-related. And here we are, the year 2014, in which the country that preaches democracy, by the way, has its first black presidents, or African-American presidents, and yet we have race still be an issue. What is the problem there? Why is this persisting?
Well, therein is really the key question, and that's the discussion that the United States needs to have among itself. About 6 years ago, the Attorney General Eric Holder said that we needed to have a national conversation about race, and we haven't done it because we're a nation of cowards. And then he turned into a coward himself and never followed up on it and never led that conversation. There's no doubt that racism is a significant part of our history. It is currently a part of our legacy. We have not eradicated racism. We've made significant progress in terms of mitigating it, but we haven't eradicated it. And I don't know that we ever will. I think unfortunately, there's more than enough racism to go around on all sides. One of our commenters commented about white racism, and one of the commenters commented about black racism. And I think they're both right. There's way too much racism to go around on all sides. I think that, we need to have this conversation and take what could be a good progress-inducing conversation down to the gutter with their race baiting and other despicable tactics. We need to have a good conversation with people who are interested in finding a solution, not people like Sharpton and Jackson who are interested in lining their pockets.
Well, we can see your views there, Michael Lane, on Reverend Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. Omali Yeshitela, your views.
Yeah, they're pretty bad.
And your views on Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson.
I don't have good views on Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. I mean, everybody knows Al Sharpton is a snitch who worked with the FBI, wore a wire to try to criminalize people who are involved in the struggle for black freedom in this country, is reputed to have actually attempted to locate and arrest Assata Shakur for the United States government. But that's not the issue. Sharpton and Jackson themselves have worked effectively for the United States government. Sharpton is the primary water carrier for Barack Hussein Obama, and Jesse Jackson was the Africa representative for William Jefferson Clinton, former president. So both of these, you're talking about establishment guys, and even as you talk about what the president should do around offering dialogue and what Holder should do, Sharpton and Jackson work for the very same president and the very same Holder. So they're all in the same camp, and that's the real problem. And when we talk about racism, and the one guy said it was white racism and another guy said it was black racism, the reality is that racism is simply the ideological underpinning of a social system that's based on exploitation and oppression of African people in this country and other people around the world. So my issue is not whether or not the people, cops like black people, or whether Holder or anybody likes black people. The question is, what is the political relationship that this country have with African people? And that is a colonial relationship. It is based on colonialism. It stems from slavery. I'm not talking about slavery as something that just happened a long time ago, but the fact is that we have never recovered from this relationship that began with slavery. So why would it be unusual that a country that has never even apologized, that has never even acknowledged the existence and the consequences of slavery, would it be unusual that the prisons would be filled with black people and so-called Indians and so-called Mexicans whose land was stolen, and around whose oppression the police organization in this country was established in the first place? So you can yell racism, black racism, white racism. The only thing we're talking about is an ideological underpinning of a system that was born of oppression, born of slavery, born of genocide. And what we see happening today with police locally and what we see happening with police internationally, that's called Marines and U.S. Army, etc., is maintaining a social system based on oppression and exploitation. So yes, the police murders on a regular basis black people in this country. It is supported by grand juries. It is supported by the entire justice system, judges, and the rest of it. That's just the reality in this country, and there's nothing that you can demonstrate that shows something different. This data speaks for itself.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about one of those data, Michael Lane, and that is the fact when you have the U.S. president saying, you know what, when anybody in this country, and I'm quoting him, is not being treated equally under the law, there's a problem. You have one black man who's being killed every 28 hours by police or vigilantes. This was just one of the sources stating this, amongst many confirming this. Obviously there's a problem. You're having a person being killed every 28 hours, happens to be African American. I'm wondering what would happen if that was every 16 hours or every 10 hours. Why is the U.S. president, who acknowledges that there's a problem, not doing anything about it? He's been in office for what? Close to 7 years now.
6 years.
6 years.
He's, well, six years anyway, yes. Look, let me say a few things here. The first is, I don't speak for the United States government, but for the record, I very, very much regret and I'm embarrassed by the fact that we have not only a legacy of slavery in this country, but a history of racism. You know, so I can't apologize for the country, but I can make my own statement. The situation with the races in the United States, I believe, has gotten appreciably worse in the last 6 years. I'm not necessarily ready to lay the blame for that at the doorstep of the White House, but I don't think that they've made any real concerted effort for a unique and historic opportunity of the first African-American president to make progress on this issue. Perhaps if they had made that one of their key objectives for 8 years, instead of backsliding, we would have gone forward and made progress in this issue. I don't know, because we didn't do that. I do know that going forward now, it's very clear that there is a substantial disconnect between the way African Americans look at certain components of our society and the way the rest of the country looks at the components of that society. And we need to work on understanding each other and bridging that gap. And, you know, my personal belief is that, you know, in the current situation that we're talking about, I've already stated that I believe, you know, hoisting the Michael Brown Memorial and the Michael Brown flag is the wrong cause to rally around. I've been, you know, told that, you know, I don't have the right to make that statement. Well, I have my own opinions, but a common goal of moving forward is what we need, not a common goal of continuing to divide ourselves, because you know, progress is made by people who were peaceful and kept at it. The best leader that we ever had was Martin Luther King, and I think you can look at his legacy and the progress that was made under his leadership.
Well, Omali Yeshitela, this whole idea of national dialogue sounds good. And let me address this question, and you could comment, because we're running out of time, and I think this will be the last question. And that is what Attorney General Eric Holder said. He said this tests the sense of trust that must exist between law enforcement and communities. And I'm going to ask you, if the sense of trust is not established, and then there's no respect from the average general African-American person to law enforcement, aren't we looking at a bigger picture where there will be civil unrest if more cases like this break out, especially in secession? Go ahead.
We're looking at the probability of revolution in this country, and that's the reality. And Martin Luther King was killed because of a possibility of revolution. Malcolm X was killed. The Black Panther Party destroyed. I've been arrested 1,000 times because of it. The fact is that we are not looking at something new. We need black community control of the police in our communities, and revolution is on the horizon should nothing happen to resolve this issue. And it's not going to be resolved by the kind of dialogue that Mr. Obama is talking about. The people are dialoguing in the streets right now. That's what's happening today in New York. That's what's happening in Ferguson. That's what's happening in various other places in this country. The people are speaking. The problem is that the ones who are in leadership cannot hear, because they have an agenda of oppression and exploitation.
Thank you very much. Chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, Omali Yeshitela, there talking to us from Tampa. And thank you, President of the American Institute for Foreign Policy, Michael Lane, who spoke to us from Washington. And thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kaveh Taghouei, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. Goodbye.